Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Kate Vitasek, who is member of the graduate and executive education faculty at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville's Haslam's College of Business, and Karl Manrodt, who is a professor of logistics at Georgia College's J. Whitney Bunting College of Business and Technology. And today we're going to talk about how to turn low-trust business relationships into high-performing partnerships. So I've argued over the past few years that we have a trust problem in supply chain management. For example, in a survey we conducted with our Indago supply chain research community in September 2021, more than half of the respondents, 56%, either agreed or strongly agreed that, quote, you can't be too careful with dealing with people across your supply chain. So why is lack of trust a problem? What are the costs of distrust? Is there a way to measure trust in business relationships? And how can companies turn low trust business relationships into high performing partnerships? Well, those are the main questions we're going to explore in this episode. And it's great to have Kate and Karl on the program to share their insights and advice on this topic. This is an area that they've done a lot of research in, and that they've actually published a recent article in Harvard Business Review that details some of the things that we're going to talk about today, as well as a white paper that was published by the University of Tennessee, again, diving into some of the things we're going to talk about today. And I'll include the links to those papers and articles in the write-up to this episode, so you can download them and read them to yourself. So with that, Kate and Karl, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Well, it's great to have you both. I mean, it's been a very long time since you've both been on the program. I think the last time you were on the program, I had a full head of hair and I was still getting over my teenage acne, but so it's been a long time for sure. And folks that are fans of Talking Logistics and have been following us for a while know that we featured your work on this program over the past few years, particularly in the areas of vested. And I see, Kate, you've got all the books behind you, and I'm a big proponent of the vested model and the work there. And of course, trust is a foundational component to vested. So I'm glad that we're going to kind of dive deeper into this topic, today. So maybe, Kate, we'll start with you, and maybe start with a very basic question. Why does trust matter? In other words, what are the benefits of trust, and what are some of the costs of distrust?
Perfect. So, I'm going to pull out a quote from Stephen Covey's book, The Speed of Trust. And he says, trust doesn't necessarily, derail a business, but a lack of trust almost certainly will. And so it's almost like, that old saying about pornography, it's there, but it's kind of vague. And so what we do know from research, and by the way, there's lots of research on this, is that high trust environments have benefits. Now, some quantified business benefits, others are qualitative business. But I just jotted down a few of the research reports that we reference in our white paper. London School of Economics, for example, studied trust-based contracts. And were you kind of leaning into those contracts? Were they more relational based, or were they more transactional? Trust-based contracts generate 40% lower cost. And you think about that, and this is very true with our research at the University of Tennessee, right? Is because if you have high trust, you're collaborating, you're working on projects together, you can feel good about making an investment. The supplier can lean in, make an investment without feeling like, am I going to get that back next quarter? So 40% cost difference, lower cost structure. That's London School of Economics. The Australian government's done some work, higher performance. Now, they don't quantify it. You can quantify it. But University of Tennessee, some of our colleagues over there have also done some work correlating trust levels with higher performance. Again, if you trust someone, you're more likely to give it your best. Common sense. But then I really like this last little bit of statistics, which was by a person named Paul Zak, and he was featured in Harvard Business Review as well. And this was related to employees, because when you think about employees, there's lots of work around here. 74% less stress. So when a buyer, a manager, and their employees have good trusting relationship, less stress, 74%, 106% more energy. I know I want to go to work and feel better about it when it's with someone I trust versus I don't. I have all that water cooler talking going on. And then surprisingly, 13% less sick days. And I guess that's because you have less stress. So lots of different work. John Hinkey and the automotive industries link supplier trust to the automotive industry. Again, great work there. But our work, Karl and I's work on compatibility and trust says, well, then what's the secret sauce? How do you improve it? So we know there's benefits, right? Even if you can't put your finger on it, you know it's there, but how do you improve it?
Yeah. And if I can add to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, one thing I just wanted to, as you were talking about that, and as we're kind of reflecting about some of this too, Adrian, why does trust matter so much? Think about the world we're in today. So you were referencing when you had hair, well, go back to that day. The environment was really different. Today, look how complex it is. And you look at all the different disruptions that occur within our supply chain or the impact social media can have on our organizations, right? So these costs are really starting to build up. And I've got to think about ways to better manage my relationships. And I can't not trust my suppliers anymore. I've got to figure out a way to do that. And it isn't just about cost, but it's a big part of it is cost, right? How do I get cost out, but how do I get innovation at the same time?
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point. And go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard of the work of Dr. Oliver Williamson. He won a Nobel Prize for his work on transaction cost economics. And if you think about it, friction, there's this transaction cost, the cost of doing business. And the more I have a good relationship, the more I have, smooth ways of working, I have higher trust, the lower your transaction cost. So you remove the friction in your supply chain, your cost structure, your happiness goes up.
Yeah, no, and I think just to add to what you both, just said there, we did some research, again, with our Indago community. I think it was either last year or in 2021. And we kind of were asking about some lessons learned from kind of the pandemic and the disruptions and everything else. And actions that they were wanting to take to make their supply chains more resilient. All right. That's one of the buzzwords that we've been hearing a lot about the past 2 or 3 years, making supply chains more resilient. Number one on the list that came back from our Indago research community. And these are all supply chain logistics executives from manufacturing, retail, and distribution companies. Number one on the list was develop stronger, more transparent, and trusted relationships with their suppliers. Because there's nothing to quantify there. We didn't quantify what that was, but they obviously realized that because they lacked that, that was one of the key reasons why they had all sorts of challenges, due to all these disruptions in terms of getting back to kind of some kind of a normal, environment, is because they didn't have those types of business relationships that enable them to, again, respond more intelligently and quickly to these disruptions. So Karl, let me go to you now, because I think it's one of these things where, you can say, well, trust is one of those things you just know when you have it, right? But is there a way to actually measure trust in business relationships? How do you know whether it's trustful or not, or whether you're in the low end or high end? I'm just kind of curious.
So I have really good news for a lot of people that are listening to the podcast and a lot of your clients, Adrian, because when they talk about we have to have this trusting relationship, there is a way to actually get there. There is a process. So it isn't like I'm a natural born singer or I'm a natural born speaker, right? And people come up to Kate and said, oh, you're just natural at it. And it's like, heck no, we work our butts off to get good, And so the same thing applies to trust. And part of it is that you have to have a process and you have to look at dimensions of trust to make sure you're not making sure that you're aligned and you're actually following those. So we're very fortunate. Dr. Jerry Ludlow and I developed a long time ago a compatibility and trust survey. And we start looking at these different dimensions that make up trust. Like one of them is just basically trust performance. Are you being consistent in your relationship, right? So you can't go up to your spouse and say, I love you. And then a minute later come back and go, you're crazy, you're nuts, and all this other stuff, right? Well, you can, but you won't be married very long, right? So there has to be this consistency in your action. There's got to be a focus with the two parties, right? So the ability to combine the individual roles with a corporate direction, okay? There has to be a level of communication. And the communication really needs to be consistent, open, planned, right? How are we going to handle situations? How are we going to do that? So that's the third out of those, which kind of bleeds into the team orientation. So it isn't, what do you do and what do I do? It's what do we do? How are we providing value? One of the great things, and this work that we're doing is so rewarding, because people talk about how it changes their lives. And I remember one of the folks we were working with said he walked into this room and it was a buyer supplier and they were working on a problem and he just looked at him and he couldn't tell who was the buyer and who was the supplier. It was just that unique as a team. They were working together. So that orientation really matters. You have to focus in on that and look at it. And then the final one is innovation. If you're into a strategic relationship that requires a high level of trust, then one of the benefits is that you can actually do things better. But if I'm going to bring innovation, I need to bring incentives in as well, right? So what am I going to get out of this for both parties? Not just the buyer can't be the only one that wins. And so we look at this as a process when we look at how do I follow through on the key areas and how do we measure it to make sure we're being effective.
Yeah, and I'm going to toot Karl and Jerry's horn because they sat around and me doing all this work with vested strategic partnerships. The question was, well, how can you measure it? And it was this research that Jerry and Karl did that says, well, how do you improve it? Trust, focus, communication, team orientation, and innovation. So 5 dimensions. And so creating a survey that goes in that you can give to buyers and suppliers and say, how is your trust? But unlike, there's another really good research. So John Hinkey's work in the automotive industry, it's kind of one-dimensional. Do I trust you or whatever, but it doesn't unpack it. And so what Karl and Jerry are able to do is unpack this assessment. So it's not just a survey, it's kind of more of a 360-degree assessment. And it scores each of the 5 dimensions. And then you can take and actually get an index. So we can give a score to a buyer-supplier partnership, this compatibility and trust health index.
The paper, the white paper that I'll provide a link to provides a lot more detail on those 5 dimensions. I like the innovation one because when you think about innovation, I mean, a lot of companies talk about innovation, but inherently a lot of innovation involves risk and risk taking by multiple parties. So you can kind of make that connection that unless there's trust between the parties, right, you're not going to be willing to take any kind of risk. So it's kind of like the prerequisite that there has to be trust there to be able to take the risk that's required to drive innovation. And I think if you believe in the fact that in order to remain competitive in this market, in order to kind of gain market share, grow, and so forth, you need to continuously innovate. Well, then you need to kind of build on that, the trust factor, because that's going to be critically important to drive this. So Kate, let's talk about the research that you've done together and leveraging this CAT survey, this compatibility and trust survey and assessment. So as part of your research, you performed 129 assessments, if I read that correctly in the paper, and this was across 98 unique trading partner relationships, more than 24 industries. So if you kind of had to boil all that down, I mean, what were some of the key lessons that this research revealed to help companies, improve their relationships, their relationship health?
Well, I think the first one is that cultural fit matters. So I like to think, drug dealers shouldn't marry Southern Baptist. So if you're not anywhere even on the same radar screen with cultural fit, it's going to, just not fit. Oil and water don't mix. But think about, all the work done on diversity. So it's not saying that I need to hire a supplier that's exactly like me, right? But when you look at business cultural fit, it's how we make decisions. Are you hierarchical or do you give autonomy, right? Do we like transparency? Do we not like transparency? So if you're dealing with a customer, a buyer that's really transparent and a supplier that is never transparent, they're not going to like each other too much. It's going to annoy them. So we look at, in the survey across these 5 dimensions, how do you score yourself? Are you innovative? Is your partner innovative? Do you like teams? Do you not like teams? Right? So, and so you think about it, the buyer and the supplier kind of have a DNA, like a cultural DNA across these 5 dimensions. And you can look at them side by side. And we actually do this. So we say, well, how do you view yourself? How do you view your supplier? And if there's some level of similarity, we would say there's a high enough cultural fit. But if they're polar opposites, we're like, there's not enough good cultural fit. Oil and water, it's probably never going to have a great relationship. Not that that supplier isn't capable, but you're going to drive each other nuts. And what is fascinating to me is that there's all these relationships that do have enough cultural fit to have a good partnership, but they don't trust. So in the case study, we talk about Island Health and the hospitalist who provide hospital services to the Canadian government. And they literally were in lawsuits. They hated each other. I think they used the words like toxic. How do you describe your relationship? Toxic, distrustful, deceitful. You'd have thought they were polar opposites. But when you looked at the compatibility and trust assessment, they actually, the DNA of the doctors and the administrators were similar enough. They had just created an environment that in behavioral economics, like a slippery slope, tit for tat. Well, you did this, and then I'm going to do this, and you did this, and I'm going to do this. Well, that's how we get to these toxic environments, because I've behaved badly, even though I had a good relation. I had the chemistry for a good relationship. I've created a series of behaviors that deteriorated our trust. So lesson number one, you have to have at least a level of cultural fit. And it's not, I'm just like you, right? We want diversity, but we need to be able to at least, accept that teaming and collaboration is good, that innovation is good. And we give an example in the white paper of a company, oil and water didn't fit together. It was a medical device company and a maintenance supplier. Maintenance supplier didn't, great at steady state. I'm here to maintain, didn't really do a lot of innovation. Didn't really like teaming. Show me my work order. I'm going to show up. I'm going to give you a service level. So the service levels were great, green scorecards, red faces, because they didn't have a good cultural fit. So number one lesson, cultural fit. Number two, and I had a hunch about this one, but getting through the data was amazing to see that my hunch was right. Number two is that your business model matters. So when you move to a vested business model, like we did with Island Health, you had good cultural fit, but they were highly transactional. But they worked in a dynamic environment. They were trying to have business outcomes. Think about in healthcare, it's always about outcome based, right? So they were wanting outcomes, but they were stuck in this transactional business model. And so by shifting to a vested business model, it unlocked all of this potential, because now you're aligning interest towards business outcomes, not just, oh, I'm a doctor, I'm going to charge you per hour to show up. And so making that shift is really impactful on trust. And we can see this because in the relationships that we have that we've trended over time, you can actually see how trust is improved, how performance is improved. And that correlation, as trust improves, performance improves. As trust improves, costs go down, because we're collaborating. We like each other. We want to work on these things. So number two, your business model matters. And as you shift to a relational contract, in particular, a vested model, you're going to improve your trust because it is a relational contract. Now, the third lesson that we have from looking at all of these relationships and monitoring their trust over time is that improving trust is a strategic choice. So think about Island Health. They were in lawsuits, they hate each other, but they were willing to come together to say, you know what, we got to figure this out. And our model, our business model, our transactional business model is dragging us down. Let's choose to trust. But you've got all this history, this baggage that comes with distrust. And so they did a bunch of exercises. We have them in 2-in-a-boxes. You give them some exercises. So as Karl said, there's some tools and techniques you can put together in helping people, choose to trust. It's always like, say, do you earn trust or you choose to trust? And people go, oh, you have to earn trust. Well, you can't earn trust if you don't choose to be trusting. And so it's kind of a catch-22. And so we put people in these little exercises where they choose to trust. And then it's amazing that you can work your way out of it. And, Island Health is an amazing example. They went from 86% negative statements about the partnership. So that one of the things in the CAT is they're asked to give every person gives 3 adjectives to describe the relationship: toxic, deceitful, distrusting, adversarial. 86% negative to 84% positive in 2 years. So what did they do? They had enough cultural fit. They chose to change their business model, and they chose to trust. So 3 simple lessons.
Yeah, no, I think, I love that in the paper. So obviously in the papers, you dive into those lessons, in more detail. But I love that section in the paper where you talk about those adjectives, because I mean, I think when I've done research in this area, obviously not to the same extent that you guys have, but I mean, those are some of the same words I hear from, from folks. I mean, I one of the research surveys that we did, someone said, well, if you, all you have to do is lie to me once, and that's it. I'll never trust you again. So lying, they're liars. That is, I think, the number one thing I heard from a lot of folks, that was the one key thing that would break their trust in a supplier.
Yeah. But Adrian, I want to challenge that, right? So, oh, you're lying to me. Were they really lying, or did you perceive they were lying because you didn't have the transparency?
Right. Yeah.
And it's that perception. And that's one of the things I just love about what Karl and Jerry have done is I measure myself and I measure my perception of you. And the vast majority of time, you've perceived something that, if we unpack it, isn't necessarily true.
But here's the other part of that, Kate, that we don't want to ask. Were you lying to them? Right? Yeah. Because it's a two-way street, right? Oh, there are a bunch of liars. Well, what did you do to cause that behavior? And did they come into work saying, I'm going to lie to you today? My goal today is lie like crazy and not get caught.
Yeah. I mean, and so when you think I've lied to you, you're going to lie to me. And then I'm like, well, he just lied to me. And you could have actually lied to me when you just perceived I did. Right. And this is where we get that slippery slope. And so we have to undo that. And this is why we say you have to choose to trust. And when you're in a strategic partnership, to let that friction and come in, that is, I mean, Oliver Williamson, transaction cost economics.
Yeah, and I think you kind of mentioned something that I think is important too, that sometimes lying can be perceived as kind of a sin of omission. It's more about, well, you're perceiving that they lied because they didn't provide data or information. So they didn't actively, tell you something that was false, but on purpose. But because their culture or they're historically haven't shared data or information, you perceive that as lying. You didn't tell me the whole truth, or so on and so forth. So I think it's unbundling, or to use your word, unpacking some of these things, I think is where you kind of get to the point where you can begin to start building, more trustful, relationships. Now, okay, you touched upon, a few case studies there. I don't know if you or Karl want to add any other examples from the papers, but I think in the papers you obviously highlight, some examples here of, the results that some of these assessments that you've done have shown, kind of the positive effects of measuring over time, the work there. So anyway, before we move on to kind of the last question, I don't know if you want to highlight any other examples or takeaways in terms of real world benefits from the work you guys have done.
What's really interesting, and there's a lot of benefits, and Kate can address this far better than I can. Normally when people go into this, it's like, how much money can I save, right? Or, what's going to happen there? And if you have a better, solid, trusting relationship, you're going to find ways to reduce our costs. Right. And notice I said reduce cost, not reduce out how much I pay the supplier. Right. So we're reducing costs for making the work better. But I think Kate also kind of hit on something that's really important on just the way that we actually do work. Look at Island Health as an example, right? You look at all these adjectives that they had before about going to work, about feeling bad about going to work. And now suddenly they enjoy going to work. We actually had a chef, if we can talk about Chef Michael, who's at Cargill, who was head chef in charge of everything in Cargill on how they operated with all the divisions. And he demoted himself down to work with McDonald's because McDonald's is kind of cool to work with. Is that a price thing? Not really, but it's a quality of life issue that really came into play. And so I think when we talk about success, it isn't just about the dollars, but it's about the lifestyle that people have in there too, and then how excited they are to go to work, the innovation they're bringing to those relationships.
Mm. Yeah, we like to say that, trust equals happiness. We put that in the HBR article. And by measuring the adjectives over time, you can actually see that people are happier. Right. So they're words of how they describe this relationship. If you measure that every 6 months, every year, that's what you're trying to get. I want an environment that is trusting, that is gives me autonomy, that lets me do good. And then from that, good things happen. Performance goes up, costs go down, sick days go down because you want to come to work. You like who you're working with. And so it's not this like increased trust, decreased dollars. There's not this one-on-one correlation. But if my focus, for example, in a vested relationship is to lower our cost structure, Dell, for example, Dell in the HBR article, we talk about how in 2 years, they were able to reduce their cost structure 50%, 50%, right? But you choose to trust, you choose to create the mechanisms that are going to build trust. So it's work. You can't just magically say, oh, I don't have trust. Well, if you don't have trust, then what are you going to do about it? And the compatibility and trust assessment clearly gives you a path, a roadmap across each of the 5 dimensions to improve that trust, if you choose to trust. And if you choose to work on tangible things to build those trusts. One of them is transparency, communication. You want to have a better trusting environment? Improve your communication. Be transparent. The more transparent you are, the more trust is going to go up.
Yeah, no, great points. And I love the trust equals happiness, takeaway. I mean, I think that also has, an impact of, another topic that we've been talking a lot about the past couple of years is, this labor shortage in the industry, and the fact that there's, fewer and fewer workers out there, period. And so it's imperative for companies to retain the workers that they have. And part of retention is making sure that people are excited to go to work. They are happy with, the work that they're doing and the contributions that they're making, that they're working in not in a toxic environment, but in a productive and, constructive environment and so forth. So I think even from that perspective, in terms of employee retention, which I know many companies and supply chain executives are wrestling with in terms of how to retain, folks. I mean, I think that this plays a part in that as well. So Karl, I'll go to you, to wrap us up here, and Kate, you can certainly add your thoughts on this question as well. I mean, what are some of the most common barriers or challenges companies face in building trust with their suppliers and other trading partners, and how can they overcome these challenges?
Well, one of them was what Kate talked about. She said you have to choose to trust. But choosing the trust isn't a one-time deal. It's a continual deal. It's a day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, choosing to trust your supplier. Because we all have natural tendencies to go back to our own selfish ways, right? So choosing the trust is really kind of a critical one to think about, that I have to practice it on a continual basis. There's really good news. When you start looking at a lot of the case studies we've done, and some of them were toxic, and you go, man, these people never work together again. The reality is they did. And what we got to take from that is that people can change, right? But what they need is a process that enables that change to occur. And then probably the last thing I'd kind of think about where there is just that the alignment matters, right? So when I start thinking about metrics, and Kate and I have spent a lot of our time in metrics as well, I have to make sure that I'm aligned, right? And then that my incentives are aligned as well. So being consistent in those areas, making sure that we choose to trust on a continual basis, and making sure that I don't think that I can cheat and get away with it, right? It's choosing the trust continually.
Yeah. And I echo that alignment. And this is where vested, that's why, our second lesson is your business model matters, because vested aligns the interests of the buyer or the supplier. It's not us versus you, buy versus sell. I get a lower price, you get less profits. We're creating this win-win alignment of interests with the same goals and objectives. And so sometimes you can choose to trust, but if you're misaligned, on your goals, your business model isn't aligned, it's still going to drag you down. And I'll leave with this fun story. So with Island Health, so they had good cultural fit. They had a toxic environment. They said, we need to choose to trust, but their business model was holding them back. It was misaligned. And if they didn't fix that business model misalignment, they were still going to be stuck in an old environment. So they took their contract, they did a little 3-day workshop. They took their contract and they said, this contract made me be deceitful because my job was to do X, which is opposite of what you do. And so they actually kind of looked at it and we had them dissect. It's like, what do? You're contractually obligated to create this environment to hate each other, to be against each odds. And so they took that contract and everybody got a page of the contract in the workshop. They tore it up and tossed it into confetti and said, this contract made us create this toxic environment. We're going to choose to trust and create a win-win environment. And therefore, look 2 years later where they're at. They're innovating. They're in the news. Healthcare, right? COVID. They're innovating in COVID. They're innovating in all these different regulations where they're trying to come up with new ways. And so that's the spirit of the collaboration and the teaming and the communication and the innovation, those 5 dimensions that Karl talked about.
That's a great story, and I think my takeaway is going back to my opening comments. Like we have a trust problem in supply chain management. So like everything, the first step is really to acknowledge that we have a problem, right? And then the question then becomes, what are we going to do about it? And I think both of you in the research that you've done provide a nice framework and roadmap on how to address some of these low trust business relationships and see if you can get them into high performing partnerships. So again, I'm going to encourage everyone to download and read the reports that we'll include in the link. But today, both of you provided some great insights and advice, and I'm sure we can probably spend another hour talking through all these results and ways of building trust. But again, thank you both for making the time to be with us today.
Excellent.
Thank
And
you,
Adrian,
Adrian.
I want to give your audience and members, you've been such a good partner to us in sharing our stories over Vested for a long time. But if people reach out through you and want to do a compatibility and trust assessment, we'll let them do a second one for the same cost as one. And so go out and start by understanding your awareness. Do a compatibility and trust assessment. Know if you have gaps. Know if you have a good cultural fit, and then you can start to take the journey.
Well, that's great. I appreciate you bring that up, and we'll certainly highlight that as well. Because I think it is, like, I think Karl, you mentioned it earlier on. It's like, well, we can talk about trust and building trust, but you ultimately, like everything in life, you have to actually take some action on it to get on the right path. So I think if for companies that are out there that are this episode resonated with them and they really want to tackle this, I think that's a great opportunity to get started. So again, thank you both for joining us. I want to thank those of you that joined us today. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Talking Logistics website or via Karl or Kate, and you've got questions for them, I'm sure you can post them there, and they'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.